The first topic is the domestic division of labor. A 2019 study by UCL with heterosexual couples found that women do closer to 16 hours of household chores each week, whereas men do closer to 6 hours. Women did most of the domestic chores in 93% of the couples, and there was a 50-50 split in 6% of the couples, and only 1% of the couples had men doing more domestic chores than women. Parsons describes two roles, instrumental roles and expressive roles. Instrumental roles are taken by the husband. They involve being the breadwinner of the family, aka being the one who earns the money. And expressive roles are taken by the wife, and they're geared towards the primary socialization of children and meeting the family's emotional needs. They're a homemaker rather than a wage earner. Parsons believed that women are more biologically suited towards expressive role than men. Next, we have Bott, who describes the types of roles. So there's conjugal role, which is just a role within a marriage, joint conjugal role, which is where couples share household tasks and spend their leisure time together, and segregated conjugal roles, where the couples have separate roles. There's a male breadwinner and a female homemaker. Next is the March of Progress view by Young and Wilmot. Young and Wilmot's symmetrical family argues that there's been a long-term trend away from the segregated conjugal roles, and that the role of the husband and wife aren't always equal but are becoming more equal. Social changes such as changes in women's position, geographical mobility, new technology, and higher standards of living have given a rise to this. Next, we have the conflict view, which is the feminist view of housework. Feminists reject the March of Progress view because they believe that women occupy a subordinate and dependent role within the family. Oakley believes that Young and Wilmot exaggerate the progress that women have seen. This is because she found that the contributions were actually minimal. Only 15% of husbands had a high level of participation in housework, which is very little evidence of symmetry. Bolton expands on Oakley's point, adding that specific tasks are exaggerated, with men taking on childcare tasks, but leaving women with the child's security and well-being. Furthermore, Ward and Hetherington found that tasks around the house were still subject to sex typing. Wives were 30 times more likely to be the last ones to do the washing, compared to men being 3 times more likely to have washed the car. However, there was evidence of a general attitude shift among young men who no longer believed that housework was a woman's role and admitted to not doing their fair share. A 2016 study found that women do 3 times as much housework than men in Indian households and 4 times as much in Pakistani and Bengali households. This compares to 2 times as much housework than men in white and black British households. The second topic in couples is, are couples becoming more equal? Stats show more women are going to work now than compared to when Oakley did her research in the 1970s. A 2022 ONS study found that the female employment rate was 72.3%, while the male employment rate was 79%. The March of Progress view, Gershny says that women that work full-time do less domestic work than others, and Sullivan says that over time there's been a trend towards women doing smaller shares of domestic work and men doing more, reflecting changes in attitude. However, the feminist view brings up the concept of the dual burden. This is developed by feminists to criticize the March of Progress view that families are becoming more symmetrical, with both the expressive and instrumental roles being shared between men and women. The dual burden argues that although women are in paid employment, they still continue taking on the bulk of the housework, like cooking and childcare. For example, Hochschild brings up the concept of emotional work. Women are managing the emotions of everyone in the household, all while exercising control over their own emotions. Furthermore, we have Duncombe and Marsden who bring up the triple shift, basically saying that women have to take on emotional work, paid work, and housework instead of sharing the burden throughout the family. Sullivan also brings up that mothers have the responsibility of planning and organizing family quality time, and that the way that mothers experience leisure time is different to fathers. Fathers have blocks of uninterrupted time, but mothers are more likely to be interrupted or must have it around their childcare. Cultural explanations for the gender division of labor is that the division of labor is actually determined by the patriarchal norms and values that shape the gender roles in our culture. Women perform more domestic labor because that's what society expects them to do. Gershny found that couples whose parents had a more equal relationship are more likely to share housework equally themselves, suggesting that parental role models are important. He also argues that social values are gradually adapting to the fact that women are now working full-time. Dunn adds that lesbian couples had more symmetrical relationships because of the absence of traditional heterosexual gender scripts. Material explanations for the gender division of labor is the fact that women generally earn less than men means it's economically rational for women to do more of the housework and childcare, while men spend more of their time earning money. Sullivan says that working full-time rather than part-time makes the biggest difference in how much domestic work each partner does. He suggests that this may be because working full-time brings women's earnings much closer to that of their partners. Han adds that for every $10,000 a year that a woman earns, she does 2 hours less housework per week. 1.3 Resources and decision making. Barrett and McIntosh found that men gain more from women's domestic work than they give back in financial support, and this financial support often comes with strings attached and can be very unpredictable, and men make most of the decisions about spending. Kempson found that family members don't actually share resources such as food and money equally. For example, in low-income families, women often denied their own needs and they'd go out less, skip meals, or eat smaller portions of food. These findings are supported by Graham, who found that women were better off on benefits than married because their husbands were a less reliable source of income. Powell and Volga talk about money management. They say that men get to make most of the decisions as they often contribute more money, and that there are two types of control over family income: the pooling and the allowance system. The allowance system is where men give their wives an allowance, out of which they must budget to meet their family's needs, and the man retains any surplus income for himself. The pooling system is where both partners have access to income and joint responsibility for expenditure. For example, they have a joint bank account. Using the pooling system indicates that the division of labor is fairer, and this is more common amongst couples that are both in full-time work. But it can be seen as unfair when the man has more control over the system as well as more influence over the decisions being made. It doesn't mean equality, because if pooled income is controlled by the husband, he still has the final say. Harder found that important decisions were usually taken by the man alone in dual career professional couples. His career was a priority when looking for the house. Finch also found that women's lives were often centered around their husbands' careers. Edgell said that very important decisions were made by the man or jointly, but men had the final say. These involved finance, a change of job, or moving houses. Important decisions were made jointly, seldom the wife alone, usually to do with the children's education or where to go on holiday. And less important decisions such as decor or food purchases were made by the wife. Gershny and Laurie found that 70% of couples in their study had equal say in decisions, which is evidence of some change. Women were more likely to have an equal say in decisions when they were high-earning, well-qualified professionals. The personal life perspective view. Nyman found that not all couples attach the same meaning to their money management. They define it differently depending on their relationships. For example, same-sex couples see little importance in how money is controlled. This leads to a greater codependence in same-sex couples, whereas this isn't the same in heterosexual couples. Feminists argue that the differences in decision-making aren't due to earning power, but are the result of patriarchy as it's produced gender socialization through the cultural definition. This is 1.4, domestic violence. Coleman found that women are more likely to have experienced all types of abuse. Coleman and Elsman found that 2 women a week are killed by a partner or a former partner. The Dobash and Dobash research found that violence sparked over perceived challenges. Marriage legitimates violence against women by giving power and authority to husbands and makes wives dependent. This raises the question, can we trust official statistics? Ian found that police and prosecutors may be reluctant to pursue a case due to having an underlying belief that women can just leave if they really wanted to. Victims may be unwilling to come forward due to feeling that they may not be taken seriously or because of their children. Therefore, official stats may not give a true count of domestic violence. Some common assumptions about the family life is that the family is a private sphere that should be left alone, the family is good, and that women could leave if they wanted to. This explains women's reluctance to come forward due to the police and other state agencies not wanting to get involved in family life. The radical feminist explanation of domestic violence. Dobash and Dobash's findings are evidence of patriarchy. They see the key division of society between men and women. Men are the enemy. They are oppressors and exploiters of women. Marriage and the family is a key institution and a main source of women's oppression in a patriarchal society because men dominate women through domestic violence or the threat of it. Therefore, domestic violence is inevitable because of it, as it serves to preserve the power that all men have over women. To validate this, you could say that rad firms claim that all men benefit from violence against women and that they ignore the fact that not all men are aggressive, and most are opposed to domestic violence and fail to explain female violence. The Crime Survey for England and Wales also found that 18% of men have experienced domestic violence since the age of 16. It's not just women who face domestic violence. The groups that are most at risk of domestic violence are young women, those in the lowest social classes, and those with long-term illnesses and disabilities. This is the materialistic explanation of domestic violence. Violence is the result of stress on families caused by social inequality. Those on low incomes or living in overcrowded accommodation are more likely to feel stressed about money and housing. This reduces their chances of maintaining a stable, caring relationship and increases the risk of conflict and violence. For example, over worries about money, jobs, and housing. This may spill into a domestic conflict as tempers become frayed. A lack of money and time also restricts people's social circle and reduces social support for those under stress. This is useful in showing how social inequality produces stress and triggers conflict and violence in families, as those in lower classes face greater hardship and thus stress, helping explain the class differences in the statistics on domestic violence. However, unlike the radical feminist approach, Wilkinson and Pickett failed to explain why women, rather than men, are the main victims. Marxist feminist explanation highlights the role of capitalism in male violence. Women absorb the angers of men, with Ansley describing women as takers of shit. The crisis of masculinity explanation. Male identity crisis could lead to masculinity being expressed through violence, re-exerting their power due to the feminization of the economy and changing domestic roles. And that's 1.4 domestic violence.